Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for doctors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. We take a brief break from our series on demystifying the Medical Council of New Zealand standards to talk about supervising other doctors and what to do when things are going pear-shaped. My name is Dr. Chow Yen Chen. I'm a medico-legal consultant with Medical Protection and anaesthetist with Te Whatu Ora. We're very lucky to have Sarah Dalton from ASMS today, and I'm also joined today by Mr. Adam Holloway, partner at Witten and Carney Law Firm. We're fortunate to hear from Dr. Lucy Gibbard, fellow MLC, and GP, and Dr. Sam King, fellow MLC and GP also.
Hi, Chayan.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Chayan.
Hello.
So with the number of international medical graduates in New Zealand, for which we are incredibly grateful, and specialist trainees, many of our members are either supervising other doctors or are being supervised as per the Medical Council or training college requirements. So let's start with talking about who must work under supervision. So these are postgraduate year 1 or 2 doctors, which includes those international graduates who have passed the New Zealand Registration Examination, or NZREX. Interns are supervised by a clinical supervisor who is vocationally registered in the specialty where they are placed. They also have a pre-vocational education supervisor, or PES, who acts on behalf of Medical Council to oversee the delivery of the intern training program. So, as registered medical officers in New Zealand, some doctors will enter training schemes and then practice under supervision until they are vocationally registered, or when they become accredited to practice without supervision. And international medical graduates, or IMGs, will also require supervision until they gain registration with the Medical Council. So they fall under 3 types of registration: provisional general, provisional vocational, and special purpose. And they cover locum, teleradiology, postgrad training, research, or visiting experts. Some IMGs from Australia are not required to practice under supervision. And so the purpose of supervision is to orient the internationally trained doctor to the New Zealand health system so they become familiar with the required standards of practice. So as you can see, many of us provide supervision in our everyday work. And if you're interested, Medical Council does have a statement and a handbook on supervision, which you can feel free to look up. But today we'll go through some of the headings or subheadings that talk about supervision. I'd just like to raise that supervision and mentoring is different. Mentoring is typically narrow in scope. It's more informal, and supervision involves an evaluative element. So, like I was saying, Medical Council has a handbook on supervision, and under that subheading, there's qualities or characteristics of good supervision. And in general, good supervision enables a doctor to review and develop their practice in a supportive environment and enhance their knowledge, skills, and professionalism. And in addition, supervision encourages a culture of continuous learning and development. So, supervision is a fundamental part of the medical profession. Here at MPS, we get lots of calls about supervision from supervisors and also from doctors being supervised. And today I'll give some examples that take issues from a number of different cases so that we can discuss some of the difficulties that supervisors face. We know that there are some key areas that lead to disputes between supervisors and those they are supervising, and they range from system considerations like process issues or limited resources to facilitate the supervision process, or punitive resolution processes that become adversarial. And then there's always interpersonal difficulties in giving or receiving feedback. I know that I myself sometimes feel very defensive when I get bad feedback, or discrimination, which can be direct or indirect, or, of course, specific behaviours in the workplace that are inappropriate, such as bullying and harassment. So what happens if you're supervising a doctor who you find hard to get along with, and in fact, you find it hard to be objective, or you're finding yourself avoiding interactions with them because you don't want to criticise them and you're finding a lot of what they do irritating? And I know as an anaesthetist, well, when I was an anaesthetics trainee, we used to tell each other the pet hates of the various consultants in the department so we wouldn't inadvertently do something to annoy them because, anaesthetists are never grumpy. But what do you think? Lucy, what would you suggest for our doctor who's just finding their supervisee incredibly annoying?
Annoying, yeah. It's not uncommon, is it? And look, at the end of the day, personalities are really important in this kind of relationship. And yet being objective is so important, especially as the supervisor. You really do have a responsibility to the doctor who's supervising, whether or not you find them annoying, to be objective. And there's a few things that you've really got to ensure. You've got to make sure that that person is practicing within their scope, and you've got to make sure you're giving them time so that you can meet them and actually see that. If you find them particularly annoying or hard to get on with, sometimes that means that you avoid them. Yeah. And actually there's less contact than there would normally be with your standard you've got your standard supervisee. So I think if you're finding them annoying, just make sure that you are actually doing the job properly to start with, and make sure you're using the time you need and setting that aside to actually supervise them properly. And if there are issues, make sure you raise them and talk about it, because it's amazing how often we get calls from registrars who have come to the end of a run and then get a supervision report that says all sorts of things, none of which were mentioned during the actual run. And I think that becomes not just a shock, but it also means there's no opportunity to actually fix it. So I think making sure that you do raise issues sooner and raise them in an objective way. So you've got to find examples of how you actually are finding their interactions difficult. And if you're finding them difficult, maybe other staff members are too. So just thinking about that. So if they are having challenges with their communication skills, is there something that can be done about that? Can you raise it with an intern supervisor or with the department and actually get them extra training maybe? You have got to make sure that you are supervising them closely enough so that if there are actual clinical issues with the work that they're doing, that you know about that and that you're able to address those. So the other thing is, if that relationship has really broken down and you're actually finding that you can't supervise them properly, then I think you need to actually talk to other doctors, other senior doctors within your department, and actually try and work out together how that person could be appropriately supervised if you feel yourself that you're not able to do it.
Yeah, so we do get calls from doctors being supervised who raise those exact issues, that they feel like the feedback they received was very scarce, and then when they did receive the feedback, it wasn't anything that they could do. There wasn't a behaviour they could change, that they just felt like they didn't get along, or they were just being really irritating to their supervisor. And so, out of interest, Adam, what can supervisees do if they receive what they consider to be unfair feedback? Does it mean that they're stuck with this really negative report?
Yeah, perhaps Shayan, just before I address that, it's been interesting hearing you talk about the being a good supervisor, and it strikes me listening to that really what you were describing, these sorts of attributes, is just also being a good manager. I mean, I'm obviously not a doctor, I work as a lawyer, and that process of going to university straight into a workforce in the medical community, which is really quite structured and hierarchical, can potentially lead to people being leaders in a clinical situation and very, very highly skilled, but haven't been forced to spend a lot of time learning and reflecting on how to be a good manager. And so a lot of what I find myself having to do with staff in a competitive environment where we're competing to employ good lawyers is exactly the same sorts of things, about making sure when you're giving feedback that it's constructive, that it's something that people can actually understand and modify or respond to. So I'm sure there must be so many good resources out there, and I appreciate doctors are extremely time poor, but a lot of the information that you can get about learning to be a good manager in all sorts of different workforces would echo and be valuable for senior doctors as well. So sorry for that diversion, but you asked me about what supervisees can do, and I guess if someone phoned me up, one of my first pieces of advice would be to just take things a little bit slowly and remember how small a country New Zealand is, and immediately falling into a very adversarial type of situation where you're complaining about a behaviour you feel you've been subject to in a strong way can make a rod for your own back. And I'm not saying that you should let really appalling behaviour slide, but if there is a way to negotiate or to find allies within a department and find a way through a difficult supervisor-supervisee relationship, it's probably better to take that path than to try and really confront the problem in a way that you're going to fall into a real fight. It can make your life very difficult. So things to do would be, but I think there's both a medical counsel side and an employment side. You are an employee, you've got rights as an employee. If you have access to a union, either ASMS, if you're a senior IMG, or another union if you're an RMO, then you can get assistance through reaching out to those resources about trying to deal with the employment aspects of not having a good manager. In terms of the council, that you can and you should reach out to them and speak with them, but always obtain approval from the council before changing your supervision arrangements. Don't try and do something informally that's going to cut across who's actually been appointed to be your supervisor. All of that needs to be agreed in advance. Also obtain approval from the council for any changes to conditions before they're implemented, and keep the council informed if something's not happening, so you're not actually getting your supervisor's reports on time or not having that contact time that you need to succeed in the supervision relationship. So that's what I would suggest, is go slow and try and sort it out gently, at least initially. But if you need assistance, there's either within your employment, Te Whatu Ora, there'll be HR people you can talk to, there'll be union people you can talk to, and MPS if you're an MPS member, but also then talking directly to the medical council if things do need to be changed.
Can I say that for IMGs who are already senior doctors and may hold vocational registration in their country of origin, who are in that supervisory relationship with a vocationally registered SMO here in New Zealand, that there is a little bit of, really they're peers in some respects. It's different from the SMO-RMO relationship. And I think in that can become really fraught. And I think that stuff around soft skills, how we get along with each other. I have witnessed a number of doctors who have got amazing skills in communicating with patients and whānau, but that skill set doesn't seem to translate to collegial engagement or interactions. And so I think that slowdown in having patience with each other is a really interesting thing to contemplate, and what skills and time you feel able to bring to that supervision relationship, and what that means when, to all intents and purposes, you are peers, because that's a weird relationship to be having with somebody, and it requires a little bit of thought. I also think there's sometimes a cultural competence component to it, depending where your colleague comes from, whether English is their first language, whether they've got strong family and community ties, where they are, how long they've been in New Zealand, what else is going on in your department and your service. And I think, there's a lot of talking, the cases that come to us, there's been a lot of, and you totally can come to us, whether you're a supervisor or being supervised, and sometimes both come to us and we have to sort that out. But it's... I've lost
talking
track.
past each
Talking past each other. A lot of talking past each other has
that's
happened.
What you were about the other thing I think that's really important there is expectations, because I think some senior doctors who've been SMOs in another country and then come here, they kind of see the supervision as a tick box exercise. They don't actually think that person is actually going to supervise them or actually comment on their practice or anything like that, because obviously they've been a senior doctor where I don't need supervision. And so the expectation of the supervisee and the supervisor may be completely different as to what they're expecting that supervision relationship to entail. And I think that is really common when it's SMOs with SMOs.
It's a fantastic point. And also where they're from, if they've got more defined hierarchical relationships, they're used to being literally, I say this and
So I think
do it,
setting those expectations at the beginning, and I also think the thing that sometimes falls down is when you're going into a very busy department, that orientation doesn't always happen very well. And so I'm thinking of a case that I've assisted with where the orientation was woefully inadequate because of resource constraints within the department. And so nobody really said, this is what supervision is, this is what we expect, you're supposed to have meetings this often. I don't think he even knew he was supposed to be having meetings, and there weren't any meetings, so there you go. His expectation was met. However, when it actually came to there being problems, there had been no one knew what was happening. The supervision relationship hadn't been clarified at the beginning, and nobody, neither the supervisor nor the supervisee in that particular situation, knew what to expect of each other. So I think if you are going to be supervising a colleague or in that situation, making sure at the very beginning you say, this is how this works in New Zealand, this is what we expect, this is how often we're going to have meetings, what are your expectations, and so just lay it out so that everyone doesn't feel that they're then being criticised when they're being supervised.
You've got to wonder that when an IMG comes into the country, what MCN's, Medical Council, what information they've been provided. And same with the supervisors, because they are acting as agents for Medical Council. And Medical Council obviously have expectations and standards. And you would think that there might be some information that would have been transferred.
But I think the thing is, I think a lot of doctors think it's a tick box. And then I think some supervisors think it's a tick box too. But actually, if you've got a mismatch between the two, I think that's... And I think the information's there. I just think people don't really expect what's going to happen.
Sarah, I was going to ask you, what are the employer's responsibility in this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and again, something that's often missing, I think. I think there are often assumptions made that the department will simply get on with dealing with this. That's a medical thing or that's a clinical thing. They'll sort it out. I do wonder if chief medical officers and their services and some of the senior clinicians need to have delegated roles or specific roles to oversee those things, to make sure that stuff is happening. You made the point, Adam, about HR. Unfortunately, they are not often a great place to go.
Right.
If you do want de-escalated advice or support, and the knowledge they are likely to have around supervision requirements for doctors will be slim to none in most cases. There's also quite high turnover in HR, so you don't often get that institutional knowledge that might help plug people into those support networks.
That's a really good insight, and to use it as a suggestion that if you are looking for help, not to seek it in HR, but rather come to ASMS or some other port of call.
Yeah, but I also think, maybe if you can have some services in a perfect world, as well as having a supervisor, you might have a buddy, so that you've got someone who you don't have that supervisory relationship with, but who can help you out, and you can potentially, ask them the dumb questions or the things you're not sure about. But I also think the point you made, Adam, about, I think everyone's made this point actually, if there's a concern or something you don't think is right on either side, you should have the conversation as soon as possible, but make it can you help me understand? I'm not sure. Not an adversarial conversation, but this doesn't feel right. I don't understand what you're saying. I don't think this is quite right. Can we sort it out early? But, there's a culture in our hospitals that you don't do that you do workarounds of difficult people, and that's really destructive.
I think that the buddy idea is an excellent one, and something, Sam, you raised about how much information people have when they come into the country as newly registered doctors in New Zealand. It depends a little bit on your route in, how you've become registered, but I think the risk is particularly acute with SMOs coming into a position and there not being an issue around supervision or their performance, but they don't always get a good induction into what the Medical Council's professional standards are, or even where to find them, or even that they exist. And certainly there are cases that I've assisted with where you have really good doctors who it's great that they've come here and we want to keep them here, but then they've run afoul of really simple things like prescribing to family, because the country they've come from have a completely different attitude towards that. And nobody, for example, a buddy, has taken that opportunity to say, hey, look, go and have a look at this page of the Medical Council website. Things are done a little bit differently here in relation to that topic.
A lot of the local doctors don't know that about that statement. Adam, I just thought I'd say that. So we've been talking about supervisors who are very hands-off, but I think there are probably supervisors who are perhaps too hands-on.
Yes.
And so I thought it'd be good to talk about how much do you need to supervise an IMG who's got provisional vocational registration, who've, are SMOs in their own right in their country of origin. So how much should we be supervising them?
Can I just say too, it reminds me that it should be a reciprocal relationship. That kind of supervision relationship, you should have an opportunity as a supervisor to learn quite a lot of stuff from your colleague. Like, wow, this is how we do it there because blah, 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 or I've never experienced that. That's so interesting. And again, when there's time and space, you're more likely to have that reciprocal relationship. But I think that can be a helpful frame to put on that relationship that might make it less contested and less potentially adversarial. I don't think I answered your question about the employer's responsibilities entirely either. But I think, bringing an SMO into New Zealand is a massive financial commitment, and the onus needs to be on the employer to make sure that person feels welcomed, feels supported, knows exactly what the rules are, and knows who the people are that they can go to in the first instance if they've got any concerns, any worries, any misunderstandings, because it costs so much to bring those people here, and often their families as well. And actually we want them to stay, and we want them to be able to settle down and practice medicine over decades, not just months or a couple of years. And we all know that IMG churn is quite high here in New Zealand. Not all of that is simply because the IMG decides this isn't for me, or I want to go to Australia now where the money is. Sometimes it's on us where we've just kind of missed the bus. And I think that sorting out your vocational registration can be a real issue.
So I think that what Sam was talking about how much you supervise someone is really important here, because like you say, if you've got someone who's come over, they're a specialist in their own right, the amount they need to be supervised is quite different to the IMG who's just finished medical school and have immigrated or have moved over and they're really new to the system and to medicine itself. So I think it'll definitely depend on the person in front of you, how much training they've had. And a lot of that is sorted out, is dictated by medical counsel, how much supervision they require. And then on top of that, the supervisee also has responsibilities. So they need to know what scope that they're working in, how much supervision they need to have, how many meetings, and if they're not doing well, they need to know how they can fix it so that they can successfully gain registration. Because we, like you say, we want them to stay.
Yeah. Do you think there are also issues, and you'd be much better placed to understand this than me, if someone comes from a system where they typically have worked in much larger hospitals with a higher degree of subspecialisation, and then coming to New Zealand where many services are much more generalist in nature and people are expected to practice across quite a broad scope within their specialty? That must be a bit of a challenge too sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've certainly heard of that from IMGs who say that, they're not used to doing, for example, they might have subspecialised in cardiology or whatever it is, and suddenly they've got to do all of the gen med. That's got to be daunting, mustn't it? And they are the SMO on the spot.
That's right.
So I'm sure it can be very difficult.
Yeah.
So I think that's where that buddy system really will help. We've got someone who's not evaluating you. Someone, like you say, to ask questions.
I think depending where someone has come from too, it might be possible to put them in touch with someone else who's come from that similar
right.
place, maybe who shares the same first language as well, so that they do have other outlets and they're really plugged into a range of resource people around that supervision relationship. But I also think, there may be occasions where someone is genuinely and objectively, to the extent that that's possible, not ticking the boxes and not making the grade. And then it's how do you have those discussions? Are they going to be able to practice as a MOS? Or are there more significant concerns, and how that is managed? And that's really, really important, I think, so that, people can be dealt with respectfully, and to the extent that's possible, they can maintain their mana and their dignity through what will be a really, really traumatic process potentially.
Yeah, I would say that there needs to be enough supervision so that the IMG is safe, patients are safe, and, like with anyone that you meet, you're going to get to know them, their competencies, what they do well, what they're not quite doing in the way that we would do them perhaps in New Zealand. So you need enough supervision to pick those things up without being too much, without, them not being able to do anything, because that would be hugely frustrating, and I expect wasteful of resources.
And also that question, if you do something differently from us but actually competently, is that okay? Yes. Right? And being open to that. Also, I think that that category of competence around collegiality and your behaviours, the extent to which that impacts on your ability to practice safely, whether if a person is deemed difficult, whether that component looms larger perhaps than it should or might, because that's often the area where people fall down, right? It's not so much technical stuff. They don't fit, we don't get along. It's difficult.
Exactly right, because it's really complex, isn't it? The dynamics of trying to get along with people who are potentially your peers but still providing supervision, and they get the say on whether you get registration to work in this country that you've potentially moved from across the world to. And also, if you don't get along with them on a personal level, it's just this complex dynamic of human interaction. And we do have lots of cases where doctors who are being supervised feel targeted, and then some of them complain that they're being bullied. So, Sam, we were talking about cases you've had where this has been the situation. And can you tell us a bit more about what happened in those cases? Or
Yeah, there's one case where the supervisee, an IMG, has felt very targeted by the supervisor and undermined. And at the time that she contacted MPS, it was clear that someone had been trolling I guess, for problems that they could raise with her competence. And it ended up being, she felt very isolated in the department, and she wasn't receiving any help. She certainly wasn't being supervised. And so the supervisor was simply raising problems, but not actually helping her to improve in any way or advise her what she might do differently. So it's become almost an untenable position, and ASMS were very involved in that case. And it's an ongoing issue, so we haven't got to the end of it yet. But it's become extremely difficult for this doctor, sadly. And I mean, the last thing we want, as you say, is for them to go back overseas. And so I think ASMS are trying to help to remedy the situation through the employment avenues. At the same time, I've got another case where a supervisor has had an allegation of bullying made against them to the medical council by an IMG who the IMG had received some criticism about their clinical competence, and so raised these allegations. And we do see this. In this particular case, it came out, though, that the IMG had these weren't the only criticisms of her clinical care that she had had. So it wasn't an isolated case. And the SMO, or the supervisor in question, had an impeccable record, had very good references, and could demonstrate very clearly that his interactions with the supervisee were very good, very reasoned, and impartial. And we assisted the supervisor, and that went fine through council. Council could see it for what it is. So we've seen both sides, and it's difficult for everyone concerned.
Just imagine.
Case is familiar to me too, Sam, and it is an example of why taking an off-ramp or a mediated solution might be better than getting into that situation. Because if someone finds himself before the council accused of bullying, you can expect that they will want to defend themselves and be assisted in that, and be quite staunch potentially in saying, no, I'm not the problem, it's not me. And that can potentially have blowback for the other person. Now, it's tricky in this context. It's tricky in all sorts of industries that you have a dynamic where things can be said that maybe don't hold water, but nor do you want to discourage people from calling out genuinely poor behaviour. So there is a balance to be struck, but for the sake of a happy life and in a small medical community, if as was said earlier, if you can have the conversation as soon as possible, most supervisors, if they've got a really uncomfortable relationship that's not really working and they don't get on, they'd probably be very happy to hand over the supervisor relationship to someone else. If there's an option there in the department. So it seems to me unlikely that you're going to get someone who's in having an uncomfortable relationship but says, no, I really want to stay your supervisor, come hell or high water, right? So if you can raise it early before it's reached the crescendo or the point at which other authorities have to be involved and people have to start picking sides, then you're probably going to get a better result.
I've had a case where, this is in primary care, where a doctor was being supervised as an IMG, and he had received 2 or 3 very poor reports to council, which he felt were unfair. And he explained the difficulty that he felt was in the relationship. And it was resolved very easily because council were very happy to switch supervisors, and then everyone just got on with it. So, if you can deal with it at that kind of level, as Adam says, it's way better than everyone lawyering up. It's just not helpful.
I think forms of alternative dispute resolution in all kinds of circumstances are absolutely the way to go. But I also think people don't always realise the blindingly obvious, which is the two of us can't sort this out on our own. Could somebody help? And that doesn't mean it has to be bigger than Ben Hur. It doesn't mean HR have to be involved. It doesn't actually mean the council potentially, other than permission if there's agreement reached for a new supervisor, or even MPS. ASMS can sometimes get involved and help to de-escalate and support an alternative or informal dispute resolution approach. Just a, supported conversation with another person is sometimes enough. People sometimes think that just by calling ASMS or naming us, that's automatically escalated things. That's not the way we see life. So, but I do think sometimes if you get into that mindset of a difficult relationship, you don't see a way out, and you think about taking sides or getting allies. But actually, everyone brings something to these relationships, and sometimes they just need a bit of time and space to unpack it a bit, to step back and sort it out.
But I think often that also there isn't the training, that being trained to be a supervisor.
Yeah, it's a skill.
It's a skill. And actually having crucial conversations, having those difficult conversations where there is an issue, like Adam was saying, it's not taught in medical school. We're taught how to communicate with patients. We're not necessarily taught how to communicate with our supervisees particularly well. So I kind of think it would be nice to see a little bit more support for people who are doing supervising, maybe to actually how to raise issues early.
Also, there are a lot of services now where there are very few SMOs who actually are entitled through their college to supervise. So, if you've got a lot of IMGs coming through, and depending what their status is, they may not be able to provide supervision to other colleagues coming in who are also IMGs or RMOs. So that puts a real pressure on if someone's just endlessly in supervision, supervising others. That might not be something they have gas in the tank for, and they just, need a break.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just going on to talk about that as doctors and employers, we have a role to report a health professional who may be a risk to the safety of the public. And it's a statutory obligation. I just wondered, Adam, if you could talk to us about what that statutory obligation is.
In terms of reporting people who you think may be a risk of safety to the public, there is the ability to. So the relevant section is Section 34 of the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act. And what that provides is that a health practitioner, and so in this case we're talking about a registered medical practitioner, has reason to believe that another doctor may pose a risk of harm to the public by practicing below the required standard of competence, then the first practitioner may, so it's a discretion, it's not an obligation, but you may give the registrar of the medical council notice of that concern. And then if you do so, there's a provision in the same section that protects you from complaints, essentially, about having passed that information on. So what that boils down to is a pretty broad power to report people to the council without having serious consequences. But the way I see it is also a really heavy responsibility, because if you choose to do that, then you are going to kick off a pretty heavy sort of process for the doctor who's then subject to that. Notifications of concern about competence are taken really seriously by the council. They can then lead on to competence assessment processes and what have you, and it can become all consuming for the person who's subject to that and last a long time. So what I would say is that if you are in a position that you've got concerns, then I would still apply that threshold of, are we really talking about risk of harm to the public here, or am I just really at the end of my tether with this person? And also, what's my responsibility as a manager or a leader or a supervisor to support safe practice and improvement? Because there may well be other ways to deal with the concern short of notifying the council. That said, if that's the right thing to do, then you're able to do it. There's a provision that allows you to do it, and then the council will take over, essentially, responsibility for managing that concern. But once it's done, it's done. And it can be, I imagine, hard or impossible to repair the relationship after that.
That totally should not be a first step in a difficult supervision relationship, though. And we have had examples where people have used that notification against a colleague, and then after a very long, as you point out, very long, high-level process, it's been found to be pretty much a nuisance complaint, So you have to be really clear. Is this person that you find very difficult and perhaps deeply dislike actually potentially causing harm, or do you just really dislike them and find them very difficult, and is there a better way of dealing with this? And I think it's really important that right and that obligation isn't weaponised against supposedly difficult colleagues.
The council statement, though, is that they suggest you deal with it locally first.
Absolutely.
That you deal with it at the lowest level when it comes to competence concerns. And of course we see it on occasion where notifications are made and it seems like the motivation is other than actually they're, about serious competence concerns. And so I think in hospitals it would be better to have protocols to say, well, if you have concerns, this is what you do. It's not immediate jump the gun to council. I would agree with you, Sarah.
Yeah, completely.
I mean, the only obligation really is if there are health concerns, there is an obligation to report to council, but not for the competence.
Yeah, and health concerns, I think they have some really great processes. The health committee at the medical council,
they're great.
we find has a really rehabilitative focus, really great.
No, they are. They're very good.
They're helpful.
We've got a podcast on that.
Excellent. All right, so thank you all for listening. So for most of us, supervising is a rewarding experience and keeps us all up to date. It takes an entire system to train and maintain a health workforce. So I hope this podcast has been able to provide an overview of what might be happening or what we can do if it is not going very well with a particular doctor that you are supervising. If you've got any specific queries, we're here to talk to you and help you. Feel free to call us on our 0800 number. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic or have any questions or feedback, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Jane.